Well, hello everyone. How are you doing? Great? I mean, the conference is fantastic. I don't know if you agree with me, but I've loved, the big screen on the main stage, the food, the coffee. I mean, there are so many things, great things about this conference. Well, now we are going to talk about CSS, and we have these panelists, and we are really honored to have them today. And I'm going to start asking you for a little intro, and then maybe you can tell me something about CSS that you have been exploring or maybe experimenting recently. How about that? You want to start, Richard?
Sure. Hi, I'm Richard Feldman. So I'm the maintainer of Elm CSS, which is sort of CSS in Elm. I'm giving a lightning talk on that a little bit later today. My talk tomorrow is called CSS as bytecode, which is sort of like an even crazier thing than that. Sort of reimagining CSS and saying, what if we just compiled to CSS and didn't even think in terms of CSS semantics? I guess most of my relationship with sort of the nuts and bolts of CSS has come through Elm CSS and working on making it so that at build time it validates as much as possible about your CSS code so that it generates valid CSS. So I had a lot of experience diving into corners of the CSS spec doing that.
Cool.
My name is Sarah Drasner. I'm a staff writer for CSS Tricks, so if you ever Google Flexbox and how to work with it, you probably have landed on our site. I think next to that page for me, it's like you visited this too many times now. You should commit this to memory. I also wrote a book called SVG Animations for O'Reilly, and I'm a senior cloud developer advocate for Microsoft, which means that I actually work a lot as a developer advocate for things like serverless and stuff with Azure technologies. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrey Sitnik. I'm creator of Post CSS, and the recent thing that I found in CSS that they plan to rename color, function to change the color function to color mode, because I think Safari they steal the name, they implement already a color function, and it's taken. Thanks.
So one thing, we have a new guest. So he wasn't originally planned to participate, but we thought that he was a really key, panelist to be here today. So he was kind to join us. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Oleg, and a couple of years ago, in 2014, I wrote a library as an experiment, which is called JSS. And so since then, I'm trying to convince people to use CSS in JavaScript, and I fail all the time. So today at 5 p.m., I will try to make it right and to actually explain it.
Hi everybody, I am Javi Velasco. I am the author of a library called ReactiveConf, which is a material design UI kit. It was implemented initially using CSS modules, but that's why I've been struggling for almost 2 years, basically as a consumer of all of these libraries, on how can I build components that are really customizable. So I'm basically experienced with that kind of mess. So that's all.
Yeah, and I'm Robin, and just like Oleg, I'm also trying to convince people to use CSS in JS. And yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, so maybe that's probably a good topic to start with. So we have seen a lot of new libraries focused on using CSS and then you put, JavaScript or Elm or other languages. And this is exciting movement from what is more like the static approach. So let's start saying, are CSS files dead? Okay, maybe it was too much. Someone wants to take that statement?
They are not. Basically, what is bad or good is not up to us to decide. It's highly dependent on what you do, how many people are working with it, what problems do you have in order to keep it running, update it, you know. So by default, it's not bad.
Okay, interesting. Anyone wants to jump on the no more CSS files or like against it?
I must say the truth that I don't use CSS files in my project. I use only .js files. But I found a very good solution, like the end of this CSS versus JS war. It's called Emotion.js. And it has extract static mode that, like, if you have a JavaScript file, they use a Babel plugin to extract these styles, put a static CSS file, and then you have a full power of both techniques. Especially with custom properties, you have dynamic properties, and you have, of course, post-CSS plugins, and you have static CSS that can be used in browser immediately without compilation.
So I've been talking to a lot of people about this because we've been kind of trying to decide what direction Elm CSS should go in. And something that has been sort of surprising to me is trying to nail down, like, what are your project's constraints if you're like, I must use CSS files? And I haven't really found a good example of that yet. Other than maybe you need to target devices where JavaScript is disabled, which I guess, okay, fair enough. But really it's like, okay, so if you need to optimize for initial page load time, then you probably want to use something that's like CSS and JS or CSS and Elm, because that lets you do critical CSS, and that's like the best way to get the fastest initial page load. And if you need to optimize for download size across multiple visits, well, the JS is going to be cached the same way the CSS is going to be cached, like the static assets. And probably if you're changing the JS, you're also changing the CSS and vice versa. So having them in a separate file is not necessarily a big win. So it seems pretty hard to narrow down, like, what is it getting you that you couldn't already have by doing it at runtime? I haven't really heard a good answer to that so far. Maybe somebody's got a really compelling use case that I haven't heard of, though.
Okay, we have a pro.
What about performance? Like, if you're doing this in runtime, you anyway, there's two questions. First, performance, because if you doesn't have a server-side render, you have an empty page. But if you do a server-side render, there is a good idea that all things about programming is to keep technology simple. This is our main goal. And so if you need a server-side render, a lot of techniques just to have the same power as we have in CSS files, why we need this complexity?
So from my perspective, if you need server-side rendering to optimize for performance, then like, okay, that's fine. In terms of like complexity, I mean, so I might, like someone who's an Elm programmer now, I mean, I might turn that around and say like, if we want to say why are these things so complex, you might even go further and ask the question that my talk tomorrow will ask, which is, why CSS? So yeah, I mean, I agree that it's an important question to ask. Like, you know, it's not just performance considerations, but also like, what's the developer experience like? But I think that we have a lot of tools for compiling to these things at whatever different levels to improve developer experience. And I think it's fine to say if server-side rendering seems like a bridge too far right now, then like, how can we make that easier? How can we make the developer experience better there?
Very good. So I was thinking as well when I was preparing kind of the topics for the panel, how do you deal with, you know, different backgrounds, like designers, for example? When you move to a more like developer environment, like CSS and JS, is that a barrier for these, you know, designers in the team, or what's your experience in this?
So actually, if you maybe heard my talk before, we kind of had this exact problem in a project. And I was working with designers who have not been very familiar with JavaScript. And as we used CSS and JS, this kind of got a problem in the end, because they wanted to also help with the styling. And they felt like uncomfortable to do this in JavaScript, actually. And a nice thing that we kind of came up with was to split our components into like those pure visual presentational components and those more logical container components. Because in the end, with those presentational components, it's really all about your styling and the markup, and this is much more simpler to learn and to get into. And like 2 weeks after we kind of explored this, the designers were actually able to kind of write their own presentational components, and I think this was kind of a really good solution in the end, because we could move much more faster than having like the sketch files that export some CSS and I have to put it in the components, but now they could just write the components at the first hand.
Yeah, I more or less agree in the same point of view, but until now, when I was asked about how can a designer deal with the CSS in JS, I answered that they must learn JavaScript. I mean, that's the only way to go. It depends a lot on the context. For example, in my case, I never worked with designers that write HTML and CSS before. Usually their role is just to give me like a PSD or a sketch file or whatever, and then I write the whole code. So this is not really an issue in the companies I've been working with. But it is true that in the States, for example, it's a very regular position to be a designer that is actually writing HTML and CSS. And I'm not completely sure if this separation between presentational and container components is actually good enough, because at the end they are going to have to write some kind of logic internally to decide how the component is going to render in the end. So I think that this is definitely an issue, and they have to step back into just the design role as more pure, let's say that like that, or move a step forward developing apps for real.
So a couple years back, I worked at a giant company where I refactored their entire code base, like the component level of the code base, not everything, but the front end. What I ended up finding was that for CSS and JS and those kind of solutions, they're very possible for that kind of workflow, but the maintainability is not something that we talk about a lot. We talk a lot about writing the code, and we don't talk a lot about refactoring the code once it's already there. So that's the primary difference in why I don't think that designers who are not interested in maintaining a large code base should be working with the CSS for something. And again, this is at scale. This is not for tiny sites. But because there's a certain way that we're thinking about those components and the way that they're served and the way that everything is inherited as developers, that over time, if a designer is making something just fit and just look a certain way, it might render okay on the page, but you really do need to have that idea of like what happens when this changes down the line, because design changes. It just will, like every 2 years, you're gonna have to rewrite all of your styles because somebody's gonna come in and they're the new designer and they wanna change everything. So I think the problem isn't necessarily in the tooling, but it's in the fact that we're not talking, because CSS and JS is so new, we're not talking about it in a responsible, maintainable manner with that, keeping an eye on the future. And so I think as long as that's part of the conversation, it's okay. So that actually like makes it lean towards maybe not handing it to designers to do.
We have also seen, sorry, I just want to jump in. I'm the moderator.
No problem.
No, just joking. No, I just want to not lose the thread. So I wanted to add that we have seen some interesting projects like Sketch, React, and I think that helps to welcome less developers, like less oriented developers, like designers, when they have this tooling that can help them. That could be something that can help in this process. Just wanted to say that.
To continue on what Sarah said, is I think at a certain complexity of an application, CSS is not something simple. It's an actual engineering work you have to do at a certain level, not always. So it's there is no clear, line between something that designer can easily do with CSS, and then you need an actually engineering team to work on CSS. It's very, very different, but
yeah, just to follow up on that, and also the earlier comments about like sometimes maybe you're faced with this choice of either helping designers to adopt this paradigm or to say, well, just get further away from it and we'll draw a thicker line. So like at where I work at NoRed Inc., we have like a very collaborative relationship between engineers and designers. There's a lot of like back and forth and a lot of like, hey, I know you designed it this way, but if we do it slightly differently, it'll save me like 2 weeks. What do you think? Is that a thing? And so I think having more collaboration is an important question, not just for a maintainability perspective, but also from like, what does that mean in terms of your technologies? So like, we're an Elm shop. We have like 200,000 lines of Elm code in production. Our designers write Elm. And like a lot of people are like, what? That's crazy. But it's like, oh no, we help them learn it. And then so they're using CSS and Elm the same way as somebody might use CSS and JS. And to be honest, like for my money, I think CSS is harder than JS or Elm. So the fact that they've already mastered the hardest thing, I think it's like not much of a stretch to say that they would be able to learn the easier things too.
Yeah, there's also an interesting trend that we have seen in JavaScript, which is the improvements of the tooling. And I look at Flow and TypeScript, and I think that this can also be applied in these, these libraries. So you can get, more intelligent documentation. You can browse these styles and maybe be able to maintain this in the long term, which is not so easy with CSS.
We have a lot of experience with stylint, like linter for CSS, and we found that we could create a much more smarter tool if we will understand cooperation between CSS and HTML. And like this is also a limit if you have only CSS files, and this CSS files doesn't have a connection to JavaScript, to templates. In this case, you can't create a really smart tool. For example, to test that the color will always be accessible, because you don't know the inherited background of for this color. And like this is why I really like the idea of combining these three technologies together, because we will know more about what's going on, where this style will be applied, and like what is this relationship with others, part of the page.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Some things that we can maybe take from the audience. So let's look at these questions. So at the top we have how do you share components with the styling between multiple projects without strong coupling to specific CSS in GS libraries? So you have any experience in your projects how to approach that?
Well, how many of you are familiar with Vue's scoped styles? Anybody? A little bit? A little bit? Okay. Well, and when you're using Vue, what's nice is it's kind of, each component, like the style kind of lives with that, solution, and it's not coupled with any CSS and JS library. It is just, all of it is JavaScript that is kind of part of Vue. So that's kind of nice because you're not making an opinionated, idea towards a certain library and then changing your mind later. You can always add another CSS and JS solution if you'd like. But I think for me, as working as a contractor, working on Vue projects, being able to just switch components from place to place and having all of those styles be co-located with all of that kind of template logic has been really nice across different projects.
Yeah, I've been struggling with this for a long time because I wanted to write components that can be actually used with different styling libraries. And it's not easy at all, but the way to go, or the best way to go I found so far, is to go a level higher, to go for a higher abstraction. So instead of rendering to React elements, you can design a component to render to style components, not the library, but components that are going to render to just one node with styles already bundled. So that way you can actually describe how is the rendering of your component, how the props are passed around these elements, and then you can later provide all of those primitives using whatever library you need. It's not easy because at the end you have to describe with a lot of precision how is the communication between those nodes, but it's actually about the abstraction, I think.
This brings us another topic that I was thinking before this panel, which is what happened to Shadow DOM? I mean, not many people is talking about it. You want to talk about that?
Would love to know that. What happened to Shadow? We are waiting like for 5 years now, and we invented all these CSS and JS to mostly fix things which Shadow DOM could fix, but it didn't.
I'm really afraid of Houdini status, Houdini project status. I think it could become the same problem, like the same 5 years, I think, and there is no result. But like Houdini is so amazing, and like it will be a more bigger like loose force.
Yeah, it's still like all red. Can I use?
I thought there was an interesting, so Mark Dalgleish, I'm probably mispronouncing his last name, apologies, wrote an interesting article about like local versus global styles. And not to put words in his mouth, but kind of my takeaway from that was sort of like, just don't use selectors. Just don't do it. Just have like classes for everything and that's it. And like one class per style, per element. So far, as long as I've been like trying to write things in this style, it seemed like, yeah, this is pretty great. And you end up doing more inheritance manually a little bit, but I've been pretty fine with that. So at this point, I'm like, I don't know, whatever happens to Shadow DOM, like, I don't know if I'd actually use it at this point. I think like maybe we've discovered something that's even nicer than what that had promised, which we can implement using the technology of right now.
Also, like the death of Shadow DOM is a good example that community sometimes could create a solution. Like right now in JavaScript, in CSS, we completely believe in browser developers. We want a specification. We don't want to do anything. We don't want to decide. And I think this is a problem because, like, with all these examples with Shadow DOM, we showed that we could make things right without W3C or big organization, with experiments, with choices, with all this stuff.
I actually think that you're a really good example of something that browser specification can be pushed forward by developers inventing new solutions. Like, for instance, things like auto prefixer and post CSS. Developers creating tools that go beyond what the spec allows, and then the browser vendors having to keep up with developers and saying, okay, well, people clearly don't want these vendor prefixes anymore. Let's strip them out and we'll add supports instead or something. I think that like custom properties is a really good example of that. That wasn't even going to be in the spec at all until things like Sass and Less and Post CSS started offering them, and the browser vendors said, okay, I guess everybody needs this, like we need to start supporting it. So I think not being beholden to the spec and thinking beyond it is actually how we can push those browser specifications forward.
Very good. Any other comments on this? Okay, so let's see what else we have here. So another question, what are the pros and cons using CSS in JavaScript instead of technologies like Sass or Less?
I think the most important thing when we talk about it is to understand that there is no one CSS in JS. Like from my perspective of view, there is runtime and static styles. Also, there is a different syntaxes, like for example, CSS syntax and JS syntax, and they're not like, it could be different parts of it. For example, there is a project, I don't remember the name, so it's like, it's completely static styles written in JavaScript. You write in JavaScript and it's compiled to CSS without any runtime. So the first thing to tell about the question is understand what we are talking about, what exactly solution.
So then we can rephrase this maybe. So what do you see that the new runtime approach can bring to the table that was not possible with the static or build time CSS?
So I'm very familiar with this because until I guess, okay, technically it's still today, Elm CSS did both. Like it was like you can use it to write style sheets in Elm and it'll compile to a CSS file, or you can use the same code to compile to like JS and do it at runtime. And now we're trying to centralize, actually because of a lot of these sharing questions of like, hey, this library author decided to do it as a CSS file. This one decided to do it at runtime. We want to like pick one and go with it for the sake of the sharing. So what we're moving towards is just doing it all at runtime. So we're familiar with these trade-offs. So I guess the main things that you lose if you're doing it at runtime is you no longer have like a pipeline of verification. So for example, previously we could do stuff like, okay, if you have a color value where any of the numbers are over 255, you can get an error at build time. Now that's an error that you can at best get at runtime, and there's extra runtime performance overhead associated with doing all those checks at runtime. Also things like, so auto prefixer is something that you can potentially do at runtime, but again, it's more expensive. So all of those like transformations and things like that. Something that's different between Elm and I guess CSS and JS is that we can get a lot of verification at build time anyway because Elm has a compiler. And a type checker. So like we can do things like if you typo and say like display instead of display, like you'll get an error at build time anyway, even though it's compiling to stuff at runtime. And then the final benefit of doing it at runtime is that you can actually use the same language and the same system to make your styles vary based on application state. So like if you're doing an animation that's dynamic based on user input or something like that, that's not knowable at build time. So you have to be able to specify your animations and things like that, either at build time statically, like using hard-coded values, or use a different system for specifying those values at runtime.
Yeah, just wanted to say mostly the same. It's state-driven styles and animations is what you cannot do statically preprocessed CSS. You just can't. And also one interesting topic is theming.
Sarah disagrees.
Yeah, I don't think that's true actually.
Well, I have to specify what kind of animations, right? There is sorts of animations which are static. Like if you use keyframes, those animations are predefined. You know when it starts, you know how it looks like, and you know when it ends. But if you want to have an experience like you have on mobile phones with really reactive animations, you can do this with predefined styles.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make the distinction between spring-based and game-based animations, which is where you give something mass and physics and send it on its way, which is more interruptible animation like the kinds that you see on native, which is what you're talking about. You can't do that statically, absolutely. Sequential animation, which a lot of things are also based on, that absolutely you can do statically. And those are more useful for actually more complex animations. So things like if you need to choreograph a bunch of things happening at once in a cohesive manner, like somebody walking across the stage, drinking water, or like a menu opening where 17,000 things happen and they collapse and move together, that would work better as a sequential animation than an interruptible animation. So you're not totally wrong, but not totally right either.
Also, don't forget that any dynamic values could be implemented by custom properties. So it's called JS in CSS.
Custom properties actually are like probably the only living CSS property where you can actually have JavaScript and CSS work in tandem. So unfortunately not like totally stable in Edge yet, but we're getting there.
I think he wants to talk.
Yeah, just to go back to this, why it's cool to be on the runtime actually, is that nowadays our user interfaces react to the user interaction a lot. And being able to use the state to couple the styling, we are kind of able to get rid of this thinking about styles in time. It makes it much more easier to think about styling in time because we actually have the state to generate a style. And this, again, makes it a lot more predictable to write our user interfaces.
I wanted to add also that for the specific scenario where you are providing a component for someone else, if you want to use stuff like custom properties, which are not supported by any browser, the huge problem that you have is that all this pre-processing should happen in the client, in the guy that is at the end consuming the library. So for React Toolbox, for example, I decided to go for CSS modules at first because I wanted to bring this kind of shadow DOM, like encapsulating components, so they can be really easily modified without defining a theming or a strategy to modify styles. So the problem was that if you want to use the library, you have to install Webpack, and then you have to configure post-CSS, and then you have to add these specific plugins, but you have to change the configuration because it's not going to go to Node modules folder, for example, and it's a really messy configuration. And that should happen. I mean, people don't want that. People just want to npm install the library, import the component, and go for that, in my experience.
There is a better way to put a component to npm. It's just a use of a pack, compile everything, and like a style loader, it put a CSS inside JavaScript, and when a component will be rendered, CSS will be like inserted in the DOM. So you don't need to use post-CSS. It's completely wrong way to send a component to a user. The best way is to have one single bundle in your npm package. Everything is bundled in. You just require this JavaScript, and it's do the rest.
Okay, so we are using sometimes CSS variables for different scenarios, and I think maybe one is theming. What's your experience in using CSS variables for theming? Is that a good option, you think, or how you do theming?
I mean, I would go with the same thing again. At the end, you were defining, like, for example, a primary color for the whole thing. So the consumer is responsible from telling you what's going to be that color. So in the case, if you are using custom properties, for example, of this processing should happen in some way at building time, right? So my solution at the end was to provide like a CLI, like a different package that allows you to give like a JSON with those theming configuration variables. So you end up generating all that CSS that you can later include traditionally. So you are keeping some good parts, like for example, scoping the class names, and also you have the ability of programmatically telling what are the values that you want to get in the final CSS. But still, it's something that it should happen. So as you are going to try to reduce the friction as much as possible, but something should happen. You have to tell a way to do that instead of generating that dynamically. So if we had custom properties in every browser, that wouldn't be a problem at all. But that's not the case, I think, nowadays.
The way to do that in Vue would be to create it's kind of similar to React higher order components, but we have a thing called slots. So you can have a component that has a lot of the styling logic that's scoped, but then you add a slot where you can dynamically generate or change out the content. So that allows you to do styling and theming pretty easily.
Awesome. Any other tips on theming now? Okay, let's pick another question. How would you handle third-party libraries that does not use CSS in JS? I'm not sure about this.
I think I should take it. So there is a real problem with all the CSS and JS ecosystem, and it's about publishing. If you publish something to NPM and you want other people to use it, it should be usable without forcing people to install the library you use to produce these styles. And this is a real problem. So right now, I don't want to spoil my talk, but this is something we're trying to solve right now. We are working on it, and it's a new standard. We are working on a specification which allows you to produce something that is highly performant and reusable. So you publish to NPM not CSS and not components, but something that is like built on top of CSS, and it's easy to parse, it's small and very fast.
Worth noting that this is not a problem that's unique to CSS and JS. It's really just a consistency problem. It's like, you could also phrase the question, how would you handle a third-party library that doesn't use CSS files? Like, you know, it's just a question of like, if they're using exactly the same thing that you're using, no problem. If they're using something different than you're using, you're saying, what are you talking about? Now I have to introduce something to my build process to use your CSS files? How could you do that to me? And it's really just a matter of like, well, yeah, if they're doing what I'm doing, then it's convenient. And if not, then yeah, there's going to be friction. And hopefully we end up with some good solution to these problems, but I don't think we do at this moment.
Okay, I think the next question is similar. So when you have to work with external style guides, and then you have to integrate this with your, your pipeline, which may be using CSS in JavaScript, how you deal with this problem, which is very close to the previous question.
It's exactly the same. It's the format we are working on. It's exactly allowing you to publish with one library and use the same package with another library. It decouples finally, the components and the library, styling library you use to produce it.
Cool. Okay, let's pick some other questions that I have prepared. There's a lot of talks around changing the topic about CSS grid. Like, what's your experience with this new CSS grid, which is the new hotness?
It's baller.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I have not used CSS Grid up until today because, first of all, it's still not supported in the older browsers. This is one reason, and this is like a problem every time a new CSS standard is released, that it first needs to be implemented in a browser. And also, I really don't see anything that I couldn't already build with Flexbox.
I can tell about the tooling of CSS grids. We already have tools without usage of CSS grids. First, there is a way to use grids right now with Internet Explorer. After prefixer can add MS prefixes, but unfortunately, the properties list supported is very limited. So it will be a very, very limited part of the grids. But if you want, it's not a problem. Just add a grid through options. But I found a good plugin. It's called PostCSS Grid. I should prepare it. So yeah, I will tweet it in the PostCSS account. It's a plugin that combine all properties to one property. Do you remember the crazy grid template property when you draw the whole layout with ASCII art? The same, but with more properties, with the limits, with the sizes. And that time I was convinced to a grid because it's a very readable way to describe a layout. Right now, like when you have a flexbox or position or like floats, you have different rules and you need to combine it. Do you remember when somebody asked you to debug CSS and you just, no way. Like, because you need to understand so many lines of code compared to JavaScript. With this plugin, everything is like visible, readable, and this is my favorite part of Grid. But I don't use it in production.
Okay. Well, that's all of CSS grids then. Okay, so I have here some other notes, but maybe we can take another question. Let's look at what we have here. Okay, we are talking a lot about CSS in JS, but is HTML in JS a sure future? Thinking about web components and HTML template advancements. So what do you have to say about this?
So HTML is the hypertext markup language, and the DOM is like the structure that the web page uses to represent the elements and nodes. So HTML and JS, I guess an example of that would be JSX. that's like using the hypertext markup language, in a JavaScript file. Is that the future? I don't know. Is it even the present necessarily? Like it's certainly a common thing, like a popular thing, but I mean, again, coming from Elm, like we don't have that. We've never had that. You just call normal Elm functions to describe your DOM, and that's been totally fine. There's also like hyperscript helpers, like virtual hyperscript, stuff like that. There's just plenty of people who are not using HTML and JS today. So is it a sure future? I don't think so.
Okay. So I have another topic, which is global versus local styling. So what do you have to say about it? There's a lot of recommendations going into more local styling.
It's a very trendy topic, but a lot of people have thought that, the good example that we are thinking the trends, not in the like real reasons. If we are talking about the global and local, by some reason people forgot about inherent properties. That, for example, somebody could put, for example, star and then box sizing border box. You can use some component from the NPM and it broke everything, or your styles could broke everything by inherent properties. And unfortunately, there is a solution, but we should force Edge team to implement it. It's called. Do you have a Edge team here? No. It's called all property, and it has a few values. For example, all initial. So if you have a component, you just write all initial, and it is like clean all inherited properties. I think this is a good idea that a lot of people forgot when they talk about global versus local. We call it local reset. Of course, we have a plugin for post-CSS.
Anyone has experience with that approach?
I think that you should avoid global styles as much as possible. Of course, I mean, by default, you define a class name, for example, that's obviously global. And that's probably one of the reasons why CSS in JS and local scoping is so popular. So, but that doesn't mean that you can't write global CSS as well, like the example with the box sizing thing. Or also that you can target from a local style something global as a child. Like sometimes we go to the extreme where we just want to have like every single selector local, but this is not necessarily good. But definitely I would try to do as much local styling as possible, always, like always. You skip side effects and stuff like that.
I have some production experience with this, so I am not using inside of the entire application any global styles at all. And I'm really good.
Very happy.
Pretty happy and nothing breaks, all works. And the way I do it is we have a plugin for JSS, which is called JSS Isolate. And it is doing some magic things. Try it out. So I don't rely on any global styling. I mostly don't rely on cascading. And I do a quite complex application.
I have a story.
So it's not CSS, it's SS only.
Basically, yes.
Okay, so I have a story. I mentioned earlier that I refactored the components for this giant thing a few years back, and we had been working on this project for 9 months, something like that, and it was just a giant undertaking. 2 days before we were going to launch, an order came down from really high, like board CEO level, that they wanted to change our brand color. And we actually had that brand color defined globally. So I changed one thing in one line of code, and not only was that changed, but any tertiary colors that were affected were also affected, and also were the accessibility was still, because we had testing for that, was still standardized, and everything was a go. So it didn't delay our launch at all. So I guess the moral of the story is kind of that I think keeping things local whenever possible, absolutely, but styling is a lot about keeping the design of the site consistent. And you shouldn't put the tooling above that concept. There are things like line height that if designers change, you don't want to have to go back into 30 components and go change that line height again. That's a nightmare. So thinking about these things with a strong eye, again, I'm going to say again, like towards maintenance, towards refactoring, towards being able to move quickly when things pivot or change. And again, it's for a larger code base. Is really good. I think being able to encapsulate locally is super awesome, but thinking like with your mind about what you might need to change in the future very quickly is also really good practice.
Well, actually, that's sorry. Actually, that's something that came up. I'm coming more from an Angular background, so we are looking at Shadow DOM components. And there's this scenario where you have to, or you want to style some inner component, and then you find yourself in this kind of diatribe, like, okay, I want to break the isolation, and then there's this like evil deep selector that you look at it and think, okay, maybe I can use it and don't tell anyone, like the important. It's like, okay, this is the important for Shadow DOM. Like, okay, let's use this, change the color globally, and tomorrow will be another day. What do you think when you are trying to isolate everything and then it just kicks you, it slaps you in the face? Like, what will be your tip or best practice?
So I think if a team, like to Sarah's point about like maintainability and thinking about like how you're going to scale things, like if the team agrees on a set of practices and they're sufficiently easy to follow, which is important, then you can solve some of these things in a variety of different ways. So Sarah's story, we haven't had something quite like that happen, but we have been like thinking about it. But the way we've been doing it is with, we just have a rule on our team, which is that you're never allowed to hard code colors. They all have to come from a constants file that's like shared across. So like, again, we do CSS and Elm, so we just have like a file that's got like, okay, here's all the colors for our theme. And you can reference something from that file or add something new to that file if there's something missing in a new design. But you can never just hard code a color in the middle of there. Because otherwise, yeah, if we needed to change one, what if it didn't quite get changed in all the places? So cascading is one way to do this, and code sharing is another. And I think when you end up with questions like these, like, hey, what if it would be really convenient to just like, just write one selector that just reaches in there, it'll be fine, it'll never come back to bite us later. If you can have sufficiently easy processes to answer questions like this around code sharing and things like that, hopefully you can design a system for collaboration where the drive to do that goes down enough that you're just like, you know what, it's not actually that much more work to do it this way, so I'm just gonna do it the nice way, the maintainable way.
I think that if you are in a need where you have to, I mean, it should be possible to customize some small aspects in a very complex component, you definitely should keep all the styles globally. So how can you access that, right? So the problem, in my opinion, is that you are trying to use CSS selectors, so you have to target something, and in that scenario, you have to deal with the priority of the selector. So if you end up writing that important flag at the end, you are screwing up for the rest of the component life, probably. So I think that you are supposed to define a way or a hatchscape or something to allow these overrides. And in case you are using local scope styles, what you can do is to simply define like an object or something referring to each node. So instead of writing a selector and some piece of CSS, so the element gets selected at the end, what you can do is to give a declarative way of telling, I want to apply to this specific node these styles. But that should be implemented in some way in a layer over the component. That's a solution I've been working on so far, and I think that some people are using something similar, like telling, my component is composed by these two elements. This is element A, this is element B. So if you want to add some overrides using CSS in JS, you just pass an object telling, for this A component, for this A element, I want to add this override. So you explicitly said that at running time.
So you just remove the selector.
Yeah,
use
exactly.
some other technique.
That's the whole point. I think that selectors as they are, it's actually a problem, because you have to keep in mind what you're targeting is going to be evaluated against the whole DOM, right? So sometimes you can write a selector that you are not aware of in the long term, and at the end you add the same thing in other place, so it gets affected. And the same thing when you are going to change a complex component, even if it's scoped, maybe you change that local scoping as well. Maybe you have a scope style for a div element, like in the shadow DOM, but then suddenly you want to change that div to a section, and there you're screwed. So,
to catch up on this, selectors were not designed for the components age. That's the problem. They were designed for documents in order to target any element on the document. And they are really smart about it. You can do a lot of things, and it's fast or fine, but it's not maintainable if you start something complex, and you can write something inside one of the components, something that targets another component or all other components, and breaks everything. That shouldn't be possible.
Okay, we are kind of in the wrap-up time, so I'm gonna ask you, each of you, to give, wrap-up statement. Maybe something that you want the people to know about, you want to give some reference. Yeah, it's your chance. Maybe some project you're working on.
Yeah, sure. So I don't know how many Elm programmers we got in the audience, but for those who have not gotten into Elm, that's a prerequisite for using Elm CSS. But if you want to check it out, we're doing a free workshop, Elm workshop on Friday. I'm hosting it. I think we're at like 70 people signed up, but it's capped at 80, so I think there might still be some room. Also writing a book, Elm in Action, for Manning Publications, and I did a 2-day front-end master's workshop on Elm. So lots of ways to get started if you want to get into this Elm CSS thing, or if you check out my talk tomorrow, the next evolutionary leap beyond that. So check it out.
I'm just going to touch on something as the closing note that I'd been talking to Richard about yesterday, which is that anxiety. I think as developers, since there are so many tools and there's so many different ways of working, and there's like JavaScript is really a buffet right now. What ends up happening is people get this like anxiety that they're not using the right tools. They should go use this other tool. They should write CSS like this other person, and then next week they got to write it like somebody else, or JavaScript for that matter. I think really the key core thing is to write something that makes sense for your team. And just keeping in mind, how things are going to scale in the future, how you're going to maintain things in the future, and to not worry too much that you're doing it like every single other person in the industry, because that's just a road to madness. So I guess if I have a closing note, it's relax and try to find the simplest path.
I really like the new idea of styling CSS, but unfortunately I did not see a really smart plugins. Like styling is very basis. They have a few smart plugins, but not enough. So if you want to make some good open source to become like popular and be on this stage, it's a good way to it's very easy. There's a free space for everyone. It's just having an idea and implement some good linters. So let's make our CSS more maintainable by a good, very smart linters. So if you have create an idea and write a plugin for styling, it will be very nice. For example, like free idea, slow properties, like calculate the slowness of your CSS, like box shadow or something, or like compatible plugins or something else.
My final note would be don't fear CSS and JS. It's not a new language. It's just CSS. And JavaScript is just a constraints automation. It gives you something that you can use in order to write styles which don't break other people's code. That's it.
Yeah, I would say that there is no perfect solution at all. So it depends a lot on your context. I mean, CSS and JS might not be like the perfect solution for every use case. Particularly I've been using CSS modules in an internal project, and I'm very happy with that because I don't have to expose those components to anybody else, so I have full control of the building pipe and everything. So it doesn't mean that there is a perfect solution or whatever, but you have to think about that have something different as we did with React. We are generating all the HTML and forgetting about that in class names or changing DOM nodes or whatever. It's automatically handled for us, right? So we can do exactly the same thing with CSS in JS, because at the end, the view is not just HTML. And we are saying that a component is a function of the state that generates the view. But CSS, it's outside that word for React, in particular. So it totally makes sense to do the same thing with CSS that we are doing actually with HTML. So just get the concept and try out different solutions and find the one that suits the best for your case.
All right. First of all, I was waiting all the time to get this one question about the atomic CSS actually here.
It's okay.
Whoever asked this, just to let you know, you can check out my project, Fila, because it's actually generating atomic CSS in the end, but you can still have like this better developer experience in writing your style just as an object. And as a final sort, I maybe would say that you should take everything we actually tell you just as an inspiration, because that's only what we have experienced that worked for us, and that you kind of shouldn't listen to us, but explore yourself and just, use what works for you.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good ending. Like, don't listen to us. But yeah, that was an interesting panel. I think we covered quite a lot of topics, most of the popular ones, and probably we can keep the conversation going after the panel. I'm sure you will be able to reach any of the panelists and ask any more detailed questions that maybe are, troubling you. But I think that they did a great job. So if we can give them a round of applause.